My name's Karl Widerquist, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the history of the basic income movement. It seems, or it might seem, as if basic income has appeared out of nowhere in the last few years as it's taken off in the international discussion around the world. But what I intend to argue today is that this is really the third wave in the basic income movement. Support has come and gone and come and gone again, and now and each time it has come back. It has come back larger than before. There was a small wave in the early 20th century, then it went away for a while, and then in the 1960s and 70s there was a considerable wave of support, especially in Britain, the United States, and Canada. And then it went away again and has come back since 2010, and now is featuring more importance. And it's bigger and has more support now than during the previous two waves. I want to look at it this way is a bit to understand what's happening now in this historical context and what that can tell us about the movement. But also I want to discuss a little bit about how the support has varied over the three waves. So the idea of basic income is not new. You can trace antecedents of it going back to ancient Greece or even to early hunter-gatherers if you look back far enough. To get to someone actually spelling it out, basic income as we know it today, a regular income in cash given to everyone as a right of citizenship. You go back about as far as a man named Thomas Spitz, who was writing in response to Thomas Paine, who was talking about a one-time dividend for everyone. And Thomas Spitz is taking that a little bit farther in the 1790s and arguing for a regular income for everyone. You get it again from Charlier in the 1840s, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that you get a number of people talking about it at the same time. And this is why I would date, even though the idea is much older, I would say that there's nothing that you can at all characterize as a wave of support until the early 20th century. You have some followers of Henry George who are very concerned about the great growth in wealth with the continuation of poverty at the same time, and talking about taxing natural resources and resource value and giving it back to people in the form of government services. Some of them, including Henry George himself, although kind of as an afterthought, does talk about redistributing some of that resource tax in cash, which would make it a form of basic income. You get Bertrand Russell, who does not give it a name, but very clearly defines it in an essay from 1917, just over 100 years old now. Virginia Woolf, in her feminist series of lectures, A Room of One's Own, is arguing that women need a basic income to protect them from the vulnerabilities of the market economy that basically forces them to get married, whether they want to or not, to stay alive, and then free them to make the real kind of contribution that they might choose to make. The first effort to make a political movement around it was begun by Dennis and Mabel Milner under the name of the State Bonus Movement. It was or the State Bonus League, which is very short-lived in the early 1920s, but a good effort. An American politician named Huey Long, who was a governor of Louisiana and a senator from Louisiana, was building a presidential campaign about what he called Share the Wealth, which was essentially a basic income under the name Share the Wealth. Had he not been assassinated in 1935, he would probably have run against Franklin Roosevelt from the left, trying to promote this Share the Wealth as a more radical version of the New Deal. What would have happened then, we don't know. Major Douglas was a British a British financier, or at least student of finance, who was studying the banking system and the credit system, and was arguing that we need a whole host of financial reforms, which included a basic income under what he called the national dividend. And the social credit movement became a series of organized parties, including the Social Credit Party, which, even though he was British, the Social Credit Party ended up taking control over winning elections to take control over the government of 2 Canadian provinces in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But the Social Credit Party actually never made any moves to introduce social credit. So that was sort of a high watermark for politics of basic income in the 30s and 40s, but it didn't come to fruition. There was also a fairly big academic discussion in the 30s and 40s with people like James Mead, Lady Reese Williams, Abel Lerner, Friedrich von Hayek, Oscar Lange, and G.D.H. Cole, who G.D.H. Cole was the one who coined the term basic income, which did not become standard until about 60 or 70 years later. Now the standard term for basic income actually comes from G.D.H. Cole in the 1930s. Now, this was happening, of course, during the Great Depression. This time, a great upheaval when it was widely believed that what we were doing to support people's income wasn't working. But it died out with World War II. This growth and discussion died out with World War II and the post-war reforms after World War II when an international consensus consolidated around a conditional model of the welfare system, where it is expected that men will work, that women will stay home with children, that the government will try to create full employment for everyone who wants a job, and then categorical programs such as old age pension and disability for the people who cannot work, and use this sort of very conditional system to base our redistribution on. And although the welfare systems of the Western world they vary greatly in how generous they are. They all tend to share this conditional categorical model, that you get this if you're unemployed, you get this other thing if you're employed, another thing if you're retired, another if you're a child, another if you're a single parent who can't work because of that. This conditional system, which is really, of course, very different than the unconditional basic income. Now, and so as this becomes the primary system, this conditional system, and this system is on the rise from the 30s to the 60s, as we're getting more of this, a discussion of basic income drops down. It never completely goes away during the 1950s. Some academics, especially some American economists, keep the idea alive, at least in academic circles. But then in the 1960s, people are beginning to rethink the welfare system. In the United States, we have Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. We have a Poor People's Campaign. We have civic unrest, and we have a lot of concern about poverty. And to some extent, this is happening in Britain and Canada as well. Excuse me. And so people then are willing again to rethink not just the size of the welfare state, its level of generosity, but its overall strategy. And this creates an opportunity for basic income to re-enter the discussion. And it does in a big way. It comes from many different circles at the same time. People who, for many different reasons, from many different backgrounds, are hitting on similar ideas. So there's a welfare rights movement that grows out of the civil rights movement with people like Martin Luther King, Francis Fox Piven, and others arguing that we need a less judgmental and more universal welfare system, and they're heading on to some form of guaranteed income, such as the basic income. You also get economists such as Friedrich Hayek, who's still around from the first wave of basic income, Milton Friedman, and James Buchanan on the right, but you get others such as James Tobin and John Kenneth Galbraith on the left, talking about basic income and coming together to talk about basic income as, to some, maybe on the left, as sort of a culmination of the welfare system, filling in the cracks and doing it better, making a better, more comprehensive, more generous welfare system out of basic income is how people from the left are seeing it. But people from the right, such as Friedman and Hayek, are thinking of it as a simplification and a streamlining of the basic income and a way to get more bang for the buck, as we say in the United States, because in a conditional welfare system, such as we have around most of the world today, you spend a lot of money determining who is eligible for what and getting them the thing. And for some programs, not so much true for old age pensions and for unemployment insurance, but for other programs, such as temporary assistance to needy families, as we have in the United States, or in-kind benefits such as food stamps in the United States, we spend more on the overhead cost than we do actually redistributing money for people who need it. And this was something that was very appealing to people to the right of center. Because back then, Friedman was writing things like, well, you might dream of getting rid of all the welfare system and just having a total free market. He says that's not going to happen. But what we can do is make a less wasteful, more efficient welfare system. And so on this logic, as a streamlining of a welfare system, you had what looked like a left-right consensus moving towards basic income. This then attracts policy wonks. A lot of people who work in government and are writing about policy are looking at making policy work better, are hitting on negative income tax or basic income and talking about it as a scientific solution to policy or the obvious next step in policy. And this is further boosted by the 1960s version of the automation movement. People are talking about automation today, but remember, in the 60s, computers were new. In 1950, there were something like 10 computers in the United States. By the 1950s, mainframe computers were going into businesses, and people were talking about replacing labor with machines, and not just regular labor, but thinking labor. So this argument that automation is replacing jobs was a very big issue in the 1960s. You had people like Robert Theobald and the psychologist Eric Fromm talking about automation, and this is creating a need for basic income. And all of this culminated in the United States with several bills for a watered-down version of the negative income tax that almost became law under the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. We also had several experiments, 4 in the United States and 1 in Canada with negative income tax. And then the discussion gradually died down after the 1972 election, when actually both the Republican and the Democratic nominee in 1972 were both on record as supporting some form of basic income guarantee. McGovern for the Democrats, Nixon for the Republicans. It looked like this was a big compromise. But it lost out with Watergate and with the inflation of 1974 and a lot of other issues. It fell out of the discussion, and the mood began to change. And people often look back at the second wave of support for the guaranteed income as a failure because no country in the world introduced basic income at the time. And in that sense, it was a failure. But a lot of important things came out of it. There was in the United States, a large expansion of the earned income tax credit, which is an offshoot of the negative income tax, and it's become one of the more popular programs in the U.S. welfare system. The food stamps program, which is sort of like basic income in a special kind of cash that can only be spent on food, which is problematic, but it is certainly better than nothing, and it was greatly expanded. And Alaska introduced what's the closest thing to a basic income in the world today, called the Alaska Dividend. all of those were offshoots of this second wave movement. So the second wave was not without success, but it died off in the early 1970s as politicians such as Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States spoke out against any compromise that's going to streamline and make the welfare system work better. Instead of trying to compromise and make the welfare system work better, people on the right hit on this strategy of demonizing just about anyone who is eligible for just about any government program as a suspected cheat, and they probably are cheats, and probably no one really deserves it. If they all work hard enough, no one would ever need anything, so we should just cut everything and not replace it with something that works better, but replace it with nothing. And though Reagan and Thatcher did not succeed in eliminating the welfare system and replacing it with nothing, they did succeed in changing the dialogue and chipping it away. And in the United States, in Canada, and in Britain, and in some other countries, for many years, beginning in 79 and 1980, there was virtually no discussion of improving the welfare system. There was a discussion of keep it or cut it. And so the right is talking about cutting it and replacing it with nothing, and the left is talking about it's fine as it is. Don't cut it, it's fine. Keep it. So you don't have interest from the right, you don't have interest in improving it, and in the left, you don't have interest in improving the welfare system, because that would admit that the existing welfare system is flawed, which is just going to give more fuel to the Reagan and Thatcher type politicians who want to get rid of it and replace it with nothing. And this very effectively took bold new ideas like basic income off of the table of mainstream politics in the US, Britain, and Canada. However, at this time, so this third wave comes to a second wave comes to a crashing end in the late 70s and the early 80s. Just as this is happening in the large English-speaking countries, basic income is taking off in other circles. It begins to take off in Denmark and the Netherlands in small ways. And it begins to take off in academic discussion in Europe, where you get people like Klaus Offa, Philippe von Parijs, Walter von Trier, Guy Standing, Annie Miller, and several other people in the 1980s coming together and creating the Basic Income Earth Network and bringing this idea to a widespread academic discussion. So while it is fading away in politics in a lot of countries, it is growing in academic discussion through the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. The academic discussion apart from politics, is growing. Now, and in this period, you also get little waves of support, and it comes and goes in Denmark a couple times, it comes and goes in the Netherlands at least once. By the late 1990s, it has a brief vogue in South African politics. And you get increasingly small radical parties endorsing it. The first one, I think, was in the late 70s I think it was in Denmark was the first small party to announce. But it's quite regular around the world today that there are small party endorsements of basic income around the world. But still, I joined the movement. I was actually, to talk about my own experience, I was a supporter for basic. I'm one of the last people who was recruited to supporting basic income at the very tail end of the second wave, when Milton Friedman talked about it on his television show in 1980. Just as the movement was dying out. I was convinced of it then, but I was a high school student and had to go through high school and college and graduate school, and so it was many years before I began writing about it. At the time that I began writing about it, in the late 1990s, the Basic Income Earth Network had been having conferences for a dozen years. I went to my first conference in 1998. The academic discussion had greatly grown around the world. There was very little activism at this time. But there was this even the activists who were in the movement tended not to lead activism. What they tended to do was write about it, like the academics, because there weren't enough people to get that critical mass of support to actually do action. So it was mostly writing, even from the activists. But it was hard to realize at the time that this support was growing and slowly bleeding over into the mainstream discussion. I didn't even understand. I volunteered in December of 1999 to write the newsletter for the new U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network, U.S. BIG we call it. I volunteered to write the newsletter. And in those first 10 years of writing the newsletter for U.S. BIG, it was hard to notice that this was a growing movement. I'd find a little news here, a little news there, a little news there. But it wasn't really until 2011, 2012, that I noticed that this was growing. And I noticed because I was following the news very closely. A few of us noticed at that time that there were more and more articles coming out. When I look back, it was crossing over into the mainstream even before that. If I had to take a date when the third wave finally began to cross over in the mainstream, if I had to pick a date, it would be in the fall of 2006, when Bishop Kamita from Namibia came to the Bien Congress in Cape Town, South Africa, and he slammed his fist on the table of the podium and said, "Words, words, words, we need action." Now, that used to happen all the time in conferences. Used to be people would say, "Oh, too much words, we need action." And then they would say how all of you should do the action that I think you should do, which was just more words. But this guy actually had action underway. He had already raised a considerable amount of money with his connections with the Lutheran Church in Namibia to have a basic income pilot project in a small town in Namibia. This brought a lot of press attention, not just in Namibia, but around the world to basic income. This was followed by another and larger pilot project that went around, that happened from about 2008 to 2010, that the project got going. And that was followed very quickly by another larger project in India in 2011 through 2013. Then, activists in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, the three German-speaking countries in Europe, began International Basic Income Week in 2006, where they're going to have an activist week. I couldn't believe it. You're going to do activism on basic income? Who's going to come? And they did these small little events, and these events grew to bigger events. And Basic Income Week is now not confined to those three countries. It is worldwide. You find events in Japan, and Argentina, and Australia, and the United States. It's grown all over the world in those years. Those little things were happening. And in 2011 and 2012, you got petition drives in one in the European Union and one in Switzerland. The Swiss one, in just tiny Switzerland, gained over 100,000 signatures. The one in the whole of the European Union gained over 300,000 signatures. And this brought a great deal of media attention. So you get some media attention from the experiments. Then you get media attention from this sort of activism. And then a whole bunch of things seem to be coming together. You have a movement, you have the coincidence of a bunch of different things happening at the same time. You have the Arab Spring happening on the heels of the Great Recession. The Arab Spring and the Great Recession aren't closely related, but where they come to relate it was student and young persons' activism against the inequality of society. So first you get the Arab Spring, then you get the Occupy movement, the 99% movement. You get activism going on around the world against the great inequality, and a lot of these movements say, here's this policy people are talking about, basic income. They hit on basic income. Activism breeds more activism. You get greater concern with poverty and inequality because people do not feel like this consensus that has been going on, this welfare system that we've had variations on this model since the 1930s and 40s, and it's been chipped away since the 1970s. people are willing again to rethink that model and do activism against it, and a lot of them come up with basic income. It comes up for people who are criticizing quantitative easing and talking about quantitative easing for the people. Instead of giving this money to the banks, give it directly to the people. You have environmentalists who are talking about a tax and dividend or a cap and dividend strategy to global warming, where you tax polluters and that takes money out of the economy. You put the money back into the economy in the form of a dividend, which is a basic income. And that is a totally different outlook for basic income. They're hitting on it at the same time. Again, the automation debate comes back, and in a way that's much more real to people today with self-driving cars and automation of factories. You can see that automation is causing this churning in the labor market. You get much more people. You have people that are rethinking the evidence that has come that came out of those experiments in the 60s and 70s. You have journalists take it up. You have now the Black Lives Matter movement endorses basic income. And you have, just this year, you have a renewed Poor People's Campaign, which was Martin Luther King's movement from the 1960s. And these people are all from all these different angles talking about basic income. And suddenly, basic income is back on the table, and now we have a new round of basic income experiments keeping it alive. So there is a strong movement, and this movement today is far more international. What I call the second wave of basic income was largely confined, not entirely, but largely confined to 3 countries, the US, Canada, and Britain, with a few overshoots in other countries. And there have been little comings and goings since then, usually short-lived in one country at a time. Now, it's an international movement where what's going on in Japan is influencing what's going on in the United States, or Australia, or India, or Western Europe. All of these things are influencing it. Philippe van Parijs describes it as with the internet and the great communication that we have now that we didn't have so much, it's hard to keep a fire contained when what's going here is much more easy to influence what's going on there. Now, one thing we've learned from looking at these 3 waves is that each wave, it's come and gone, but each wave has gotten larger than the last. And that creates an overall trend. There is an overall trend of basic income becoming a more realistic part of the discussion in the last 100 years, when it was extremely radical, when Bertrand Russell was talking about it in 1916 and 1970. Now it is much more on the table, and it was an outlandish academic idea. Now it is something that people are out there in the streets doing activism for. So this trend is big. The trend comes back when people are rethinking the welfare system. In the Great Depression, it came back. In the turbulence of the 1960s, it came back. And now, in the turbulence of the Great Recession and the renewed concern with inequality, and people are beginning to notice how much inequality has grown under the system we built since the 1970s. That concern with inequality has brought basic income back on the table. In another way, and one thing I think that is interesting that makes the third wave different from the second wave, the third wave is much more radical, at least has a larger radical component. There was a radical component with the welfare rights movement of the 1960s. But most of the movement, or what brought it into mainstream politics, was actually portrayed itself as very much of a middle-of-the-road sort of movement, as a way to compromise between left and right. We'll do the welfare system that the left wants, but we'll streamline it and make it more efficient the way the right would want. So it costs less tax dollars for every dollar that you give in redistribution. A little compromise, a mainstreaming, something that left and right can get together on. Now it is, although there is this right-of-center libertarian movement for basic income, it is now much more seen something from the left, and something that the left is seen not just as some sort of streamlining and compromise, but a radical challenge to the existing status quo. And this is how my work finds a place in this third movement. I've been writing about basic income since long before the third wave took off. That doesn't mean I can take any credit for it. but it does mean that I feel very at home in this movement that's growing. And one thing that I see that it makes it different is people are willing to see basic income as a major challenge to the way we've thought about it. When we have this conditional welfare system, it's based on this idea that the poor have to prove their worth. You have to prove that you can work, and you have to prove your work by if you can take a job, you have to take a job. And if you can't take a job, you have to prove you have to. Either you're too old, or you're looking for work but can't find it, or you're disabled, or you have childcare responsibilities that make it impossible to take care of. You have to have something to prove that you can't get a job, or you have to take a job. And if you get a job, supposedly we'll have a minimum wage or health insurance benefits or something to try to make sure that if you work, you'll have enough. And this system has never done what it's supposed to do. This system is supposed to say the poor, because the poor prove their worth by showing they're willing to work or proving that they can't work, then we will support them. We will support those who can't work, who could turn down the truly needy. And we will support those who do work by giving an adequate income for everyone who works. And to some extent, in a few countries, we've gotten pretty close to that, pretty close to building a system that almost eliminates poverty on that basis, but not quite. There are people living in poverty in Norway and Sweden. Maybe not as deep as poverty in the United States, but they are living. But in the United States, the minimum wage has never been adequate to get a family out of poverty. And the benefits for those who are disabled and those who are taking care of children are not adequate to support people who are unable to work. So this supposed consensus that if you make the poor prove that they're contributing, then we will help them is really not delivered. Not only did it, when it was popular, did it get the poor out of poverty, but it has not created a welfare system that was immune to attack. We thought, if we make it on this thing where the poor prove they're worthy, then no one will attack them. But of course, Reagan and Thatcher found how to attack them. You say, they're all cheating. They're not really needy. They're just pretending to be needy so they can be eligible for these programs. These are bad people. They're all bad people, and they're not like you this working person. They are different from you now. So people are now willing to challenge that system and say that a system that says you must work to prove your right to survive is a bad system. It is a system that advantages the rich and disadvantages the poor. It puts the poor and by the poor, it really puts every working person. If you don't have enough money to retire, no matter how good your system, no matter how big your skills are, you have no choice but take a job to survive. You cannot say no to employment. That makes you not quite a slave where you got to work for this one person. But it does mean that you don't have the power to say no to all the jobs out there. You've got to take one person of the people who are employers. You've got to take one of those and do what they say. You have no say. What if I reject all of them? None of these offers are any good. You do not have the power to reject that. If you do, you're a bad person. You're not eligible. And we threaten you with homelessness. And we threaten you with life on the street if you do not meet the conditions we set. That's the way the conditional welfare system works. As generous as it might be for those who are eligible for this, it has this threat that if you don't meet our conditions, we will make you homeless. We will deny you access to the basic needs of life. And the belief that you're not really free if you don't have the power to say no to whatever labor market system the rich and powerful have created, that you're not a fully free person. This idea, though not everyone puts it into those words that I use, this idea is very powerful within the third wave movement. And they're willing to challenge this idea that everybody has to prove their right to survive by taking whatever job is out there. And willing to challenge ideas that people who won't take jobs are therefore lazy. Whenever you have a job offer, when you have an employer says, you work for me, I pay this, and this person, I don't want to work for you when you pay that. That's a dispute about wages and working conditions. We say, everyone has their price. if the employer offered more, if they offered enough, certainly. If they offered $1 million, certainly someone would take their job. But we always say, but if the worker, the potential worker, doesn't take the job, we're a lazy worker. Like, we never say cheap employer. We never say the employer is cheap because they offered a job, wages so bad that this person living on the edge of poverty didn't want to take the job. That's a cheap employer. We always demonize the worker for not accepting a job at any wage, and we never demonize the employer for being cheap, for not paying an acceptable wage. And when we do that, we are siding in a dispute about wages and working conditions, and we're siding with the more privileged and the wealthier people against the less privileged and the less wealthy people. We need to have a system. We need to have a system that puts both in a bargaining system where both is free to walk away from the bargain. Then you get a bargain that is made out of the free choice of both. I took this job not because I have to, because the employer made it worth my while. That is when you have a truly free labor market. And if we have one with a threat of poverty and homelessness and destitution hanging over the heads of all workers, even the middle-class workers, you get a system that is not free labor. And you get a system that we've had with increasing inequality for the last 40 years, as we've chipped away at the other options that people used to have when the welfare system was more benefit, and fewer other options for workers. It is no coincidence that in all of the economic growth that we've had since the 1970s, the benefit of that has gone almost entirely to the most wealthy. The middle class and the working class have barely shared in it at all, because they have fewer other options and they have to take what they can get. They have neither gotten more pay or lower working hours. So automation has made it possible for all of us to have higher pay and shorter working hours. We have gotten neither, and we've gotten just increasing inequality instead. And basic income is increasingly being seen as a tool to fight that, for giving the worker more power, the power to reject unacceptable working conditions. And that, I think, is an exciting development, and there's no telling how far this could go. Thank you very much.
Okay. My remarks will be concentrated on the very idea of a universal basic income and unconditional basic income. The fact of this income being unconditional. This is the central point of my remarks.
I might take
First, I have to confess something. I have no religion about the question whether the universal basic income is a good idea or not. Mm-hmm. So I read your paper. I read several other papers about that question, and I would take the position of the enemy, of the adversary of the basic income, which doesn't mean that I endorse those arguments, but I will try to present them. So let's start from the main idea. Just in the way you present it, the main idea is as follows. Every individual should have access to what he needs to survive without conditions imposed by others. That's the main principle on which the universal basic income is grounded. In first societies, what you call a hunter and gatherer society, this is a condition which is not very difficult to satisfy, because there is no private property, so everyone has access to what he needs in order to survive. No private property, everything is owned in common, everyone has access. It doesn't mean that there is no rule about a way to use common resources. And I would like to quote the way you think about this rule. Here is what you say in your paper. If anyone brought back to camp more food than they and their family could eat in one meal, they had to share it with everyone in the camp, including people who rarely or never brought back food to the camp. The food shared around the camp could be seen as specifically basic income. So it's true that everyone who took part in the hunt has a right to a share. It's also true that those who are unsuccessful in the hunt have also a right to the share, even if they have been unsuccessful, because they are not to be faulted for their lack of success. It's also true that those who perform a function which is very useful for the society and who do not take part in the hunt have a right to a share. For instance, priests or everyone who performs a function like that has a right to a share. It's also true that those who are unable have obviously a right to a share. But it's not obvious that if people just say, well, we would not like to take part in the hunts, we prefer to stay home, stay idle, stay by the river, say swimming and bathing in the sun, and we nevertheless have a right to a share. It's very doubtful that hunter and gatherer societies would accept such a claim, and that they would give a share of the food brought back to the camp to those who remain idle. So more of this later, but it's a very important point. The following point is that in contemporary societies, capitalist societies, anyway, this situation has come to an end because there have been some private appropriation, and now we have a profound division between, on the one hand, owners of natural resources, productive assets, and on the other hand, non-owners, propertyless persons, those who cannot live in an independent way on the resources they own. So the situation is as follows, according to you. Non-owners are constrained to work for people who own the natural resources, and since they have no choice not to work, they are constrained to accept the conditions, whatever they be, however harsh they can be. They are not free. They are made unfree by the apparition, the establishment of private property, and private property in itself is a form of constraint on the people who are propertyless. So, in your opinion, and in the opinion of the partisans of the universal basic income, this leads very clearly to the idea that those who have been deprived of any independent access to natural resources have a right to a compensation. And since they have a right to a compensation, they have a right because they have been deprived of their freedom, this compensation must take the form of a basic income. So the argument is in 5 points, if I may say so. 1, everyone has a right to a share of natural resources. 2, private property deprive non-owners of his right. 3, this makes them unfree, and the contracts they can sign with owners of natural resources are coerced. They are not voluntary. They are under duress, of course. 4, a compensation is due. And 5, the universal basic income is the required compensation. So this argument, in my view, and in the view of many people who are critical of this proposal, this argument has 2 main difficulties. One is about the concept of freedom, which is used in this argument, and the other is about what has been called in the literature reciprocity objection, which is very important. I'll come to that after. First, freedom. I will deal with your particular version of the universal basic income, which is quite different from the one put forth by Van Parijs. Van Parijs says, well, in order to make sure that people in a society have real freedom, you have to make sure that they have the means to do what they want to do. And the more they have the resources in order to do what they want to do, the more free they are. This means that you can be more or less free according to the level of the universal basic income. And Van Parijs says that this level should be put at the highest sustainable level. You, Professor Widerquist, you say that to be free is not to have means in order to do what you want to do, but it's a power to say no. So, universal basic income should be put at the level necessary to cover the basic needs of any individual, And it should be put at the level necessary in order for any individual to be able to say no to any working proposal, that's what you said before, that could be made to it. This is your concept of freedom. Being able to say no to any relation you don't want to enter into. If you want to escape it, you should have the means to do that, just not entering any relation on a non-voluntary basis. Now, the concept of freedom that is used here seems quite strange, because it would mean that being free is having a set of options among which would be placed the option you favor most. Okay? So being free is having a set of options, and among the options you have should figure the option you favor most, which is being able to refuse any work that doesn't suit you, being able to refuse any conditions that you find yourself non-acceptable. But I guess that this is not a good way to define freedom, because you have to take into account the following point. What is the cost for others of the option you favor most? So the option you favor most is the option consisting in having an income without working. What is the cost for others? This means that being free is not having among the options you have access to the most favored option for you, but having access to all options that are deemed acceptable by the group. This could be made under a veil of ignorance. We should ask, what are the options unacceptable? For instance, working for a very low salary is unacceptable. Having very dire and very dirty working conditions is unacceptable. But working for a decent salary, which allows you to send your children to school and to live in a decent way, is an acceptable option. If you have an offer which is an acceptable offer, then you are free when you accept it. Even if you have not the option of refusing any option that you don't favor or that you wouldn't put first. So being free is being confronted with a set of options which are deemed acceptable by all the members of the group, but is not being offered an option that you, in first person, favor most. So this is a problem in the way you present universal basic income. Now, the second difficulty, it seems to me, is about the reciprocity objection. This objection is very famous and very simple. It has been put in a very simple form by John Elster, and he says this: it's unfair for the able-bodied to live off the labor of others. So it's unfair for one who can work to claim an income without accepting the obligation to work. It's unfair. This would lead the one who receives this income to live off the work of others. It's unfair. Now, there are two ways to answer this reciprocity objection. One is Van Parijs' way, and the other is yours. Here is the way Van Parijs answers the objection. He says something very simple. Look, suppose that you put a condition upon receiving an income. You have to work, you have an income. You don't want to work, you don't have an income. This would mean that the principle of liberal neutrality would be violated. That's Van Parijs' stand. The principle of liberal neutrality would be violated because the state would make a difference, a discrimination between those who want to live a working life and those who do not want to live or lead a working life. So the state wouldn't grant equal value to both kinds of lives, and this would be a clear discrimination and a clear violation of the principle of liberal neutrality. So for this reason, the state cannot say to the one who doesn't want to work, well, you have to abandon your preferred life. You have to take another way. Because this would be to judge his conception of what a good life consists in. And this is forbidden by the principle of liberal neutrality. Then, Van Parijs concludes, the universal basic income must be universal, and it also must be unconditional on any working condition, because this would be a discrimination. Now, your own version is a bit different from Van Parijs, because you think that his answer bypasses the central question. And the central question is this: are those who want to live an idle life without working and nevertheless to receive an income, are those people robbers? Are they thieves? It's a very important question, because if they are thieves, if they just want to rob the work of other people by receiving an income without any counterpart, if they are thieves, their way of life has no right to an equal value. It has no right to be equally respected. So the main question is there a robbery there? Are the surfers, Malibu Beach, thieves? If they are, they have no right to be respected in an equal way. So this is the main question which has to be solved before you can tackle the question of liberal neutrality. I will come to your own way to solve the reciprocity objection, but first I would like to mention the libertarian answer, because this leads to your answer, in my view. What's the libertarian answer? The libertarian says, well, the non-owners have not been deprived of anything. They have not been deprived of natural resources. They have not been deprived of a level of life which they had in supposedly primitive state. They have not been deprived of their freedom, and nothing of the kind. Why? Because those who are disfavored or at the bottom of the scale in societies where private property has been established are anyway better off than anyone who lives in a society without private property. So private property is advantageous for anyone. So no one has the right to complain, because no one has been deprived of anything. That's the libertarian answer. So there is no ground for basic income without or with condition. No question of anything like that. You think that this answer is off the mark. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because the point is not whether those who are dispossessed, who are propertyless, the question is not whether they are better off from a material point of view in a society where property exists than in a society without any private property. The question is not here. It's possible that from a material point of view, their situation has improved. Possible. But the problem is that although their situation might be better from a material point of view, it's much worse from the point of view of freedom. Because they were free in a society without private property, they are no longer free in a society with private property. They are constrained to work. So the owners constrain them in a way. Private property is a constraint against those who are deprived of private property. It's obvious. And in this way, owners, those who have property, those who have access to natural resource, they owe a compensation to those who are propertyless. It's obvious. So, what you say is that a correct way to answer the reciprocity objection is quite simple. It is in the following way. It's the owners who do not reciprocate. It's the owners who owe something who are untrue to the reciprocity principle, because they owe something, they took something, they owe something, but they don't want to reciprocate. So the obligation is on them to be reciprocal. It's on them to reciprocate, not on those who do not work. It's on them that the reciprocity duty is charged. So owners, in a way, owe to anyone a duty of non-interference, but they violate this duty in permanence. And since they violate this duty, they have to compensate for these violations. So surfers on the beach of Malibu are no thieves? Absolutely not. Owners are thieves. And owners have to compensate for what they have stolen, in fact. So this is your answer, which is, seems to be different from Von Parijs' answer. I could put forth two different objections to this way of arguing. The first one is it's not quite different from Von Parijs' answer, because what you say is that in fact those who do not want to lead a working life are constrained to lead a life of work. They are constrained to cooperate, even if they don't want to. So they are discriminated in a way. And this is exactly the same as what Van Parijs is saying. It's a kind of discrimination, and this discrimination is unfair. And because it's unfair, it has to be compensated. The second objection is that I'm not sure that you answer the reciprocity objection quite fully. Your answer remains, in my view, a bit unsatisfactory. Why? Because you claim that non-owners have a right to compensation without work. They have a right to a compensation. That means they have a right to have access to an income without providing any work. But you don't say why exactly. Why should those who do not want to work have a right to an income? The right conclusion, in my view, would be they have a right to have an access to natural resources. They have a right to have an access to natural resources on which they could work, which they could use, but they don't have a right to an income, and it's quite different. Let's go back to hunter and gatherer societies. If someone says, well, I don't want to take part in the hunt, I don't like that, I prefer staying by the river and bathing in the sun, I think people would say, well, in this case, you won't have any share of what we brought back in the camp, but you can go in the wilderness and provide for yourself, if you want. But the fact is that nobody would want to do that, because it would be very, very hard surviving conditions. And in my view, it's exactly the same in the case of the universal basic income. So people who do not want to work have no right to have an income. They have no right to have a share of what others have produced, but they have a right to have access to an independent share of natural resources, and the others have an obligation to provide that to them. But they have not an obligation to provide him with an income. And in a paper you wrote, the title is Physical Basis of Voluntary Trade. I suppose you know that perfectly well. I think you say exactly that. You confess it. I read, the provision of raw resources is likely to be preferred by those who believe that everyone must work for their subsistence. I would like to count myself among them. The arguments behind freedom as the power to say no imply a problem for forced work in the sense of one person serving another. But they do not imply that people have any right to be free from the need to work, in the sense of applying effort to turn raw resource into consumption. Yes, people have a right to have access to natural resources in order to work on them. But they don't have a right to an income produced by the work of other people. And you yourself just confess this point. Which would mean, if I read directly what you wrote, which would mean that there is a very good practical argument in favor of the unconditional basic income. And the practical argument is that in capitalist society, it's much more difficult to provide raw resources to anyone in order for them to work upon than to provide them with an unconditional income. It's much more easy and much more convenient to give them an income instead of making it possible for them to work on raw resources and opening for them a way to have the possibility of leading an independent life and working by themselves on natural resources. So the practical argument is okay, it's perfectly fine. But the conclusion is that the principal argument just fails. If I may have 5 more minutes, I would like to add just one thing. As you probably know, there is a long history behind us of something we call in French le droit au travail, the right to work, the right to have access to a remunerative job. Le droit au travail, droit non pas de travailler, not the right to work in the sense of droit de travailler, droit au travail, right to have a job. And there has been a famous discussion in 1848 when the French delegates in the Constituent Assembly discussed the constitution of the Second Republic. And there was a proposal to include the right to work, the droit au travail, in the constitution. So obviously some were against and some were in favor of it. Those who were against it say 2 things. One, it's not practical because it would oblige the state to transform itself in an industrial entrepreneur, which is not convenient. And it's not convenient, it's not practical, because anyway the state couldn't find a job for each person who needs it, and even less a job adapted to his skill and capacities. So it wouldn't be convenient to do that. But the major reason is a principal reason. They said that it would be destructive of private property as we know it, because it would oblige the state to tax very heavily private property in order to fund those jobs for those who would like to have access to raw materials. And this would just be destructive of private property. Private property would have to be very heavily taxed in order to do that. Those who favored the droit au travail had a very, very interesting answer to that. His name is Louis Blanc. He was in exile in England because the power didn't like him, but he put forth his proposal in a very, very relevant way. Here is his answer. He asks, what is the justification for private property in the first place? What is the justification for introducing private property in the first place? And he says 2 things. One is to make people able to work, because without private property, you would work and you would be deprived of the fruit of the work, so you wouldn't work. So the first reason why private property is legitimate is that it makes work possible. The second reason why private property is legitimate is that it would make people independent. You work on your own farm, you work with your own business, you do not depend on anyone else. You are not dominated, you are free. So the reason why private property is legitimate is that it makes people free. When you have it, of course. The problem, Louis Blanc says, is that in modern capitalist society, this is no longer true. Because instead of making people free, private property make them unfree. Why? Because property has been unequally divided, Those who have property may live in an independent way. Those who have no property may not live in an independent way. So, what should we do, asks Louis Blanc, in order to make private property legitimate again? To restore its legitimacy. And here is what he says. You have to tax private property in order to advance capital for those who would like to start their own business and operate them in a cooperative way. So the state would provide, by taxing private property, would provide free capital to those who need it, and those who receive this capital would start business of their own and operate them in a cooperative way. And the consequence of this would be that in the long run, all the economy would become composed only of cooperatives, and in Louis Blanc's mind, this would mean that the wage system would disappear. People would work in business they own collectively, without conditions imposed by others, which is the main point from which we started. Now, of course, the problem is that this would make property as we know it disappear. But one point in the argument of the partisans of the universal basic income is that they never question private property as such. Private property is deemed as something which exists as an absolute right to exclude.
You never questioned that?
What?
You said they never questioned private property as such. Who were they?
The partisans of the universal basic income. Okay? They do not question the institution of private property. But we might think that private property should be made much less absolute than it is. And it should be made much less absolute than it is in order to allow people who want to work in an independent way to be able to do so. It would change the meaning of property. But if the universal basic income is a utopia, as it is, this is also a utopia, but it's no less a utopia than the basic income. That's it.
Okay, great. I think when a person writes more than the desire they have, really more than the desire to be agreed with, is the desire to be understood. And you've definitely given me that. You've understood me. I could point to maybe some small things where I think you didn't get me right, but for the vast majority, you've really considered and understood what I'm trying to say, and that I really appreciate that. And also, so this is also, I think maybe your presentation was a little longer than it would have been otherwise, because I would say at least 2/3 of it or more was actually explaining parts of my theory that I didn't explain in today's discussion. So it's almost as if you got two presentations of my work in two presentations of different parts of my work, and only a little bit of reply from Jean-Fabien. So I'm not sure, and now replying to this for me could take a little while. I'm not sure if I should do that first, or we should go to comments from the other three of you before I give any replies. I'm not sure which way would be.
You just, because I'm not sure about the argument myself. So
Yeah.
Could you just say, in plainest word you can, why compensation must take the form of an unconditional income and not the form of a right to work? Mm-hmm. That's the main point.
Okay, so to me, when you I reject. I actually in my work I do challenge the institution of private property. I think it's something that we can and may want to use, but it's not something that people have a natural right to. I do not believe in Lockean appropriation that there is some natural right to private property. This has come up somewhat in the things that I've written so far, but most of that will come up most fully in my forthcoming book, Justice is the Pursuit of Accord. I can't blame you for saying I haven't challenged enough, because I haven't challenged as much as I intend to. Now, but this idea of reciprocity, that reciprocity favors basic income, the reciprocity does not go against basic income, is one of the oldest threads in my work. My first publication in December 1999 was called Reciprocity and the Guaranteed Income, before basic income was the standard thing for the movement. It was that long ago. And there I argue that the system that we have now does not live up to reciprocity in any sense. Now, so I'm rejecting any Lockean idea that you can just go take from the environment without anyone else's permission, and that's yours, and if somebody doesn't get some, they can go work for you.
Not what Locke says.
Well, he says a lot of things, and he's been taken to mean many, many different things. I've also written a paper on the many interpretations of Locke. So, to me, there are several ways to go with a natural environment, to go from a natural environment to deal with the fact that there are valuable resources out there. There are several different ways that are consistent with reciprocity. One is to use it as a commons, where everyone can use it, but no one can own it. And that is the way we are using the atmosphere right now. We're all taking whatever we want, giving back whatever we want, and there's still enough for all of us. That is largely the way we use the sidewalks and the streets and the parks, and the oceans. Now, and that is the way many of our ancestors actually used the land. You could take things from the land, but you could not own the land. That is consistent with reciprocity because everyone has the same access. Another way that is consistent would be to divide it equally. Then everyone gets an equal share to use as they want. I respect your property, you respect mine, we have the same. We have the same control of resources. That is consistent with reciprocity, complete equal division. Another one that is also consistent with reciprocity is those who want a larger share pay for those who therefore have to take a smaller share. That is consistent with reciprocity. And it's very strange of a person to say, well, I want a larger share of resources, so I'm going to, and that means I'm imposing a duty on you. You have to have this duty of respecting my larger share of land, where I don't respect, you have the smaller share of land, or really none, that I have to respect. That if they simply take a larger share without reciprocating, that is inconsistent with reciprocity. But they reciprocate by paying for what they take. If you take a larger share, you owe more to the people who therefore have to take a smaller share. That is consistent with reciprocity. And it's also very strange in that person to say, well, I'm going to take a larger share, and I'm going to make you work for the money I'm paying you in compensation. Well, the compensation is for the fact that you got a larger share of resources. If you want me to work, you got to pay me for my labor. My payment for the fact that I have a smaller share of resources is one thing. My payment for my labor is another. There should be no confusion between the two. If we all had the same share of resources, then we could all say, if we want anything else, you get paid for working, we'd all get paid. That would be one way to do it. But if you're having an unequal share of resources, that automatically gives you a reason for those who have more to pay those who have less unconditionally. Now, there's another way you can do it. And I think some of where the problem comes in I think maybe confuses these two. Another way you could do it that is consistent with reciprocity is to use all of those resources toward an equal public enterprise. So to have a socialist use of those resources, where they are owned by the community, everyone works for the community, and everyone gets paid by the community. In that sense, you get paid for working on the community's resources. I think it is a confusion between this private system, where some people have more and some people have less, and those who have more owe to those people less, confusing that with the public system that comes in with the idea that your compensation for someone else having more resources should have something to do with labor. Now, the public system, I think, is problematic because a public system can be oppressive. Even democratic societies are not consensus societies. You make rules by having discussion, and then a majority makes a decision. You never get a complete consensus where everyone agrees. You're always, some group is imposing something on something else. And we like to believe that this is never oppressive, and that is a fiction. It is a pleasant fiction. We have a world where more privileged people, whether it's they're privileged for their government connections or privileged for their ownership or privileged for whatever reason, the more privileged people control the dialogue and they make what they're doing sound reasonable. And that makes the potential to oppress those who don't want to fit in and do those things. That can make the public system oppressive, and that can make us confuse this private system where some have more and others have less. Confuse that with the public system. You have system-justifying ideologies where beliefs that tend to say the existing system with its inequalities in places somehow reflects just. These things tend to survive. I believe it's the hardest thing in a world for the society. The hardest thing for society to do is to avoid oppressing its least advantaged individuals. And these things like this belief that as long as it's democratic, it must be right, and then so we all must owe to it, to realize that democracies can be oppressive as well. That motivates. Why? What's that?
It could be something else, like an oppressive regime. You could have a democratic rule without being oppressive. Why not?
It's possible. I just do not find it that has a very good history or is well observed in history.
I'm sorry, but the only way you could is if you redefine some form of oppression as not being oppressed, like Rousseau's general will. These people are not oppressed because you redefine they did not understand what they really meant. The general will is going to explain to them what.
So, right now, we do not have a system that is reciprocal in any of those senses. We do not have one where all have equal access to the natural world. It's been divided up into public and private property. We do not have one that's reciprocal in the sense that those who have more pay to those who have less. And we do not have a private enterprise system where everyone contributes equally and everyone can share equally. As a matter of fact, those who own the most need never work a day in their life. If, in that Jan-Esther sense, it is the owners of the resources and the things we make out of them who are violating reciprocity, and the non-owners have a perfectly reciprocal claim to compensation that the owners don't have because they're being deprived of access to the earth by these people who have lots of it. So it makes perfect sense why these people should pay those. And if you want to take that and replace it with a public enterprise, and you think you can do that without the public enterprise being repressive in some way, because it has to pick something. It has to pick a system by which it works, and it has to pick a system that no reasonable person could say no to. And I don't think anyone has the skills or knowledge of how different people's preferences are to build such a system and have it truly be fair. It is what the prevailing ideology will think is fair. And that will be something that is favorable to the insiders and disfavorable to the outsiders. If the job of society should be to realize how hard it is to avoid oppressing outsiders, then we got to say it is not us, it is not they who have to prove their right to exist. It is us who has to prove their right, our right to their labor, by saying, we are not going to force you. We're not going to force you to do anything. We're going to offer you to take part in our cooperative enterprise. And we're going to give you good pay and good working conditions that are going to make you want to. And we're going to discipline ourselves by not forcing anything on you and giving you the opportunity to join. And this is how we attempt to build accord with you. We attempt to build accord with you by getting you a want to contribute because we made it worth your while, not because we have given you no other option. Okay, that didn't answer everything we talked about, but it answered some of it. So,
this throws the wall of the theory of justice by John Rawls in the garbage box.
Yes, it does. I am an opponent of Rawls because I think he's too optimistic about his ability to decide what is of the greatest advantage to the least advantaged individual. Because I think the thing that is the most advantage to the least advantaged individual is to not have stuff forced onto him or her by more advantaged individuals. And that's the one thing Rawls rules out.
It's also a very pessimistic view of what democracy is.
But an optimistic view of what it could be if we take seriously the danger of how it can go wrong.
Democracy
is
a way to decide collectively.
Yes.
A very pessimistic view.
Well, maybe so. One author that is very little known in French but can allow the problem is not that democracy, and to accept that democracy is a form comprised forms of coercion and oppressions does not take away from it that these oppressions or coercion may be more legitimate than any other form. And in a way, the author here that I know Karl also knows is a guy called Robert Lee Hale, whose most famous paper is called Coercion. And here, you really have this notion that it's not because there is coercion that coercion is illegitimate.
No, there could be some
legitimacy in court. And in a way, democracy as being giving one person a voice is just a way to legitimate coercion. But I just wanted to try maybe an answer. So you asked for I really liked Karl's answer because in a way, I'm just trying to put it, I had more time than him and listening to him to put it in maybe simpler words. But I guess the direct answer to your question is, so why should the compensation be cash, essentially, and not work? And I think the answer, Van Perge also mentioned it, is the idea that cash is neutrality. So the question is, why should the compensation be work? And the problem is that work is not neutrality, and you know it from the first time that you ask, what is work? And there is so many definitions of what work is, and this is the point. And this is exactly the thing that Karl was saying. The people, the most privileged or the one in power, do get to decide what is called work. And this is what the whole care and the whole feminist movement showed. Something is called work.
Yeah, of course.
So you have this. The other thing was there was this point that really interested me.
If I may say,
sure.
Work. This doesn't answer the question whether those who want to work off the labor of others are thieves or not. And the neutrality applies only to non-thieves.
It does answer. Well, the problem is that as soon as you take the question of what is work, it does answer the question that who is working and who is living off the labors of others. There's, it gets, even when you say, so to say that surfers are idle can actually be a much challenged statement. And you know what? And also, but it's true. But I mean,
I had some difficulties to convince many people that.
Well, if they see the wage that some surfers today get, the surfers, they do the stuff on the beach. Some people come, some other people gain money. It's like the workers of the spectacle industry. If anything, there probably are some examples of people you could say are idle, but surfers who do a public performance or show.
That's something else. The idea is people being quite ill.
But
servicing anyway.
But that's the problem. That who is idle? And actually, the question is not that easy to answer at all. If you start to get to look into it, you have a lot of issues. So you say people are idle, but then you find a case where people are doing exactly the same thing, and actually here they pay. And you find that the difference very often is that they get paid when they are working.
Some people do not want to work.
But that's the problem. Maybe they don't. I don't think many people want to really be idle.
I know that's something else.
But
suppose that there are some people who do not want to work.
But that's the problem. I think the problem is that most people who tell you they do not want to work take work in the meaning of they do not want to work for a wage to augment the money of someone else. They don't want the capitalist definition of work, but they do want to do something. And if they do want to do something which is productive, the fact that you do not want to call this work is contentious. But I just say that.
That's why cooperatives are good.
And then I guess the second point, which I really one point I found really interesting is on this same thing of access to natural resources is not the same as a right to an income. You had this sentence of, so the argument is one on a practical and not a principle basis. But then when you came to Louis Blanc, I mean, you had this sentence also, the solution, but you shorten it, of course, was to give the solution to make private property legitimate again, was to give everyone capital. But I mean, that's basic income. And you know, it's also
no, it's a right to work.
But
it's not an income.
But what you because giving
it's a right to
actually
work.
it's quite interesting because this thing of capital. So actually, there's a guy called Geoffrey Hodgson who is thing on the what is capitalism, and he works a lot on the notion of capital. And actually, what he is arguing is that the only meaning we should keep of capital and the real meaning of capital that is in capitalism that is original, since things that have been here from time immemorial, is capital as money. And you get back to the same thing, the right to work. So what kind of work would be, again, if you want to give people, if you say you want to give people capital, so money can be a form of capital, or if you say the right to work, you mean you're going to give them certain machines and not directly money? So who decides which machine? Who decides what we produce? Who decides, And here you get to But my point was more on the theoretical side. It also had to do, so in a way, one of the way the regimes you described was the common ownership. But I think there was something slightly flawed in your description of maybe it was just an appearance, but you had this notion of common ownership as sort of free-for-all. So, and you said, for instance, the air would be, the atmosphere today would be a common. But actually, a lot of work that I've been following, say, Elinor Ostrom's work on this, would say the air, the atmosphere, is not at all common. Because a common is something much more restrained. That's sometimes when we use the word in a loose manner. A common, people working after Elinor Ostrom argue, is something very precise. It's three things. It's a resource, a community, and a set of rules to manage it. And because the air, the atmosphere, is definitely a resource, but there's no unified community around it, and there is definitely no rules to manage it, and thus you end up in a free-for-all. And I guess to get the theoretical point on this is, so I'm translating this Jeremy Waldron paper on homelessness and the issue of freedom, and in it Waldron has this sort of his punchline is to say no one is free to do an action unless there is some place where he or she is free to accomplish it. And so in the article, so there's this idea that the radical stuff is, well, unless there is somewhere where the people are free to. But the thing is, once you put this in, the logical consequence of this is to realize that there never is any place which is not limited. And so in a way, the difference you made between the principal argument and the practical argument was based on the idea that you can make a principal argument where space is not into question, where you can make a principal that your principal argument happens in a space which is unlimited. But as soon as you take that space is limited, then any answer you're going to give to the principal problem of, well, compensation is owed, any answer you're going to give is going to have to be practical. And so, and then the only choice you have is on what is more practical. So, what is more practical, as in giving this work, or giving cash, or giving this machine, or giving a specific plot of land. But you this distinction So yeah, I'm very but I think it was you really sort of got to the nutshell of what I think Waldron's paper is putting into question. So there's this notion that it goes also probably with the fact that pragmatism is coming. Taking is becoming more important in philosophical debates today. There's this notion that practical elements are actually principles, especially for things like private property, like how to compensate for private property. Sorry, that was very interesting exchange. Very true.
Can I ask another question? Because I've been a very attentive reader of Henry George. I know his work very well, so it's quite interesting. But I think it's very difficult to enlist Henry George among the partisans of a universal basic income. For his point is that in a society that would be well organized, there should be no unearned income. No income which does not come from work. So all income that would come from rent, all unearned income should be confiscated. That's his point. And in my view, your point is just saying, well, look, I'm a member of the human species, okay? I'm a man, so I have a right to a piece of land, that's mine. And I have a perfect right to gain an income from what I own without using it, which is exactly what Henry George rejects, which is exactly what Henry George deems as the reason why societies are dysfunctional. So there should be no unearned income. And universal basic income is an unearned income. So you mentioned a way of thinking which says, well, people should have a right to the entire product of their work, which is a principle which I would favor, certainly. But the universal basic income is contradicting this principle. So two different principles. And I think society should be organized around a basic principle. All have to work, all have a right to the entire product of their work. The reason why there are these suggestions about a basic income is that society is organized in a way that people who work do not get the product of their work, whereas people who do not work get part of the product of the work of those who work, actually. This is bad organization. But the solution is not to generalizing unearned income. The solution is to make everyone work by confiscating every kind of unearned income, including income which comes not only from the exploitation of natural resources, but income which is coming from exploitation of what we call civilizational capital, which is the inheritance of past generation. If we had to work without the contribution of past generation, the wealth we would produce would be nothing. It would be vastly inferior to what people do produce. So maybe those who use the civilizational capital do owe to those who do not have access to this civilizational capital. They owe a right to use this capital, which would mean, for instance, they owe them education. They owe them education, not an income. They owe them a way to find a way to work for themselves. Education is owed to everyone, because those who take advantage of the civilizational capital do owe to those who are incoming a good education, and a free one, of course, but not an income.
Well,
I don't know.
I don't think it's quite that clear, because there's at least one passage in George. I don't know how familiar everybody is with Henry George.
Poverty and Progress, 1879.
And his other one, Social Problems, a couple of years later. He talks about unearned income in the form of rent, which he argues is a really large part of our economy. What you're really paying for is rents on resources and the things we make out of them. Now, his main thrust of his argument is to tax away those rents and use that to support government services. And he argues that that would produce far more generous government services we have now, services that could be going to eliminate poverty. Hence, in the book Progress and Poverty, why we have all this poverty when we've made so much progress, is these government services can eliminate that. And also, it makes a lot of sense here. Why is it that we pay unearned income to landowners and banks and polluting companies? Why is it we pay them an unearned income, and then all of us then pay taxes to the government? We just take the unearned income, have that be what we pay to the government, and instead of paying my interest payment on my housing loan every year and taxes, I could pay that, cut out all the money that the landlord and the banker is making, and that pays my taxes for me. That all I think makes perfect sense. It's a great idea. But he has this one, he wasn't so dogmatically against giving any of it in cash. He definitely thought that the problem was this unequal distribution of ownership, not of unearned income, not necessarily that it exists. He says, if you tax it away and you use it for what we need on government services, there's a passage where he says, what is left over, you could give back in cash equally to everyone. So he actually has one passage which Georgist basic income supporters will seize on that passage, and they will say, see, he supported basic income. And of course, you do have other people in that tradition, like Hillel Steiner and Michael Otsuka, and some others who are much more explicit on that support. Now, one thing you said there was not quite an accurate characterization of what I'm trying to say, and the difference is subtle, but I think it's important, is that you said that the owners are thieves who have compensation for what they've stolen, or I am a man, or a human being, so I have a right to my share. That is not exactly what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we have a natural right to an equal share. I'm saying that to live in any fair society, it has to be one that truly lives up to making reciprocal arrangements. And there's more than one. One is treating all the land as a commons. Another is dividing it equally. Another is those who get more pay more. Those are all different versions of reciprocal ways. And I'm not saying you have a right to your equal share. Somebody stole it. Somebody that gave you, and therefore they owe you compensation for it. So what property owners are not thieves, but what they are is duty imposers. What they have done is imposed a duty on you. You respect my property as I would respect your property if you had any property, to paraphrase Cohen. Is that they're imposing a duty on you without allowing you to impose a reciprocal duty on them. And they're compensating you not for stealing what you have, but imposing a duty on you against your will without your consent. So the difference is subtle, but it's still there. But it motivates compensation in cash. There's two different things going on in my argument for basic income. One is this: we've taken away so much access to resources that we can't work for ourselves, and that's the one you paid most attention to. And that can be gotten rid of by simply giving you access to natural resources to work with yourself. It may be too difficult for us to do that, and then there could be a practical reason for replacing that with basic income. But that doesn't necessarily motivate basic income. But you would have to do that to the point where we all have equal natural resources to get rid of the other motivation for it, which is some have far more resources and the things we now make out of that and other. And if we want to maintain a system where some have more resources and others have less, the only way to do that and make it reciprocal is for these people who have more to pay back in cash, unconditionally.
Yeah, if I may just say that if people have the power to impose duty to others, they have a power. This is based kind of prior violence, prior theft. So they have to be thieves first, and then they are able to impose a duty. You can't impose a duty if you don't have something which other people need. You can't.
Well, something. It depends how you look at it. If something is unowned to begin with, I would say it can't be stolen.
I take it. Then I can impose a duty to you.
To me, the act of taking it is not theft; it's imposing a duty. I mean, maybe the difference is semantic, but it's. I'm not trying to say we all have this naturally equal right to the environment. It's like whatever we decide to do with the environment has to be reciprocal, and it's currently very unreciprocal.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a distinction without a difference.
Everything
has to be reciprocal. It's exactly the same thing as saying that we all have an equal right. It's the same thing. Well, it's a distinction without a difference. It's saying exactly the same thing in two different forms.
It's saying that work is reciprocity, something like the Hofeld theory.
No, but what I'm saying is that you have to have a reciprocal system. Okay. And it's exactly the same as saying that each of us have an equal right to a share of natural resources. No, that's the basis.
No, if
you can't do without it.
Yes, I think if you take it the other way around, a right is reciprocity.
Because otherwise, I would say to you, well, you have no right. Where does the right come from?
Okay. Let me tell you.
Let me just suppose something. Suppose we are 5 in this room, and comes a space lab with 2 people in there. And they say, well, we want an income. Because there's no place for us to stand. We want an income. Give us an income. Would you say yes?
Does the ship still work?
What?
They go back does their ship still work?
No, it's broken.
If they crashed here, sure, I would say so. Yeah.
Without work?
Yes. It doesn't matter where they came from a birth canal or they came by.
The 5 of us would have to pay it for life. An income to those people just because they are there?
If you don't want to give them an equal share of resources, yes. If you want to say, we'd rather give you an equal share of resources, you can do that instead. You'll find a better practical solution will be to give them cash.
The 7 of us, now because we are 7, we deliberate on a just system of sharing the income of our common work.
But you already, I think.
Okay, but no one who doesn't work has the right to share.
No, but your work has an income already. For your work to have income, you need to have no more.
The 7 of us will deliberate on a just way to share what we produce. Those who do not contribute have no right to share.
So, okay, but if they just arrived, then that's the point.
We owe them a language course.
No. The question is, do the 7 of us occupy the whole of the space that is available to us?
That's
so
the way to go.
If we
no
occupy,
other place to go.
So if we occupy the whole of the space, could you really argue that just because the 7 of us say, well, these 2 we don't like them, we don't owe them anything? If we occupy we stop them from doing anything. We occupy everything, and they are here, and we deny their very existence. Well, if we
do not deny their very existence, we acknowledge them as humans. As equals, they have equal right to share the common product of our work.
Well,
under the condition that they contribute.
Okay.
That's quite simple.
So the only solution they have is to contribute to our endeavor and not their endeavor. If they have something else they want to do than what we decided we want to do, then we deny that.
We are going to accept any proposal they would make.
So we're
going to accept and deliberate about any proposal they would make.
But we are a group and they just arrive. We're probably going to listen to them very carefully.
That's quite a problem.
I guess it's also I found one thing was very interesting in what you mentioned is what you came to is something that has been haunting me since I had to listen to Bernard Friot, and he has this idea, this thing of lucrative property. And in his big projects, I'm sure you're familiar with it, he has this idea of the abolition of lucrative property, which is something that you attributed to Henry George. So let's make it impossible for the two. So I think that this is quite interesting. So then you raise the question right away: is this even possible? I think Friot doesn't even address it. He doesn't care. It's like, revolution is a millennial process or something. He doesn't, we'll see. But I think that's really, so as you mentioned, it's really questionable whether it is ever possible, because you sort of necessarily use the resources of past generation of something. But then your solution was quite interesting, because if it is not possible to abolish lucrative property, so if
to abolish
lucrative, so rents, if rents necessarily exist,
but why?
but that's tell me, how could it be that there be no rents? Rents, there's always a rent. The question,
anything that's scarce has value,
and thus produce rents.
Lots of anything that's scarce and useful has value, and that's why there are always rents.
We agree.
Yeah.
We agree that everything which is scarce has value. That is why this value should be shared among us.
So if you share it equally, so then if you say everything, so there is rent. So if there is rent, the question is how you distribute rent, and basic income is just an answer to the basic income is saying the only way to distribute rents is equal share. And that's so what is basic income is and one way to understand the negative income tax, you say universal tax rate. So there is a rent, and the rent has to be shared equally.
I don't agree. There is a way to distribute wealth according to the contributions of each of us. Not equally.
But this is not. But Josh, we're talking about rents. There is necessarily rents. That's the question is, if there is rents, then these rents have to. Then what do you do with these rents? Your reasoning. Okay. Maybe your solution. Okay, hear your solution. Your solution was to say what you advanced earlier was to say that if there is a rent, then the way we could compensate it, so that if there is a rent we cannot suppress. So your example of the rent we cannot suppress was the product of past generation. And so your solution was we have to provide free education. But I found one of them. But my question is, I caught the idea coming into my head. I was like, you're pushing me to the extreme. I feel like a libertarian or something. Yeah. But it was there is no such thing as free education, not in this sense. I mean, who decides what we're going to teach? Who is going to teach it? And so in a way, and this is also, and actually this is Friedman's stuff. Friedman's thing on education was to say, if then you just give me money to people and they will buy education. And they will then decide themselves what kind of education, what kind of. So and the problem is, as soon as you, so if there, and so the bottom line is the only legitimate answer to rent is split them equally. So and that's basically.
But I mean, you can split them equally in the form of cash, or split them equally in the form of government services. Both of those live up to the idea of splitting the rents equally.
I agree, but the problem is, I'm not against free education, but I would say the problem here is that if you follow the reasoning is government provided public services are cash. At some point, you do pay for. So if people need these things, they will. They will. So one form to manage this were vouchers, for instance. But the problem is vouchers often you have vouchers and for-profit system. But if you say, so this service has to be provided with not making profit, and you have vouchers, then you do have the public service, but you also have the people who choose which kind of service they want to use. Then I guess there are other arguments to say we should all have the same education, but I don't think these arguments. So I am in favor of free education, but I don't think the argument for free education is the compensation of private property. See, I think so. The argument for having a specific form of free education, it cannot be for me the compensation of rent.
It's a question of intergenerational justice.
Yes, there's many other fields.
Owes the following generation a good education. Owes it. That's all.
I've been feeling increasingly guilty for the last half an hour because the three of us have talked non-stop the last hour and 45 minutes. Now this is not just because we're men. It's partly because we're men. But it's also because we've all read a lot of the same articles, which I'm guessing neither of you two have read. So article specifically by me is what makes this conversation different than most. And if you hadn't read my stuff on the power to say no, it's probably not surprising that we've dominated the conversation. Have I, or maybe I'm wrong, have either of you read those? Okay. But maybe you want to comment on what you've heard about this issue in this discussion, or maybe you want to go back to the original presentation on history-based income, or anything else you'd like to talk about.
Unfortunately, time is up.
I must confess that you half convinced me.
Well, we still have dinner. I never got the chance to explain the distinction that goes with the difference. So if you want to go for dinner, we can keep trying.
Okay. Sure. If you want to ask something, go ahead, but I think no comments.
Okay, well, thanks for listening. I'm sure you're thinking about it. And I just to clear the whole. These are rabbits.
Yes.
These are little rabbits. The whole I thought it was just like some stitching, but it's actually rabbits.